Hello guys and welcome back to something a little new. So today we're going to begin a new Q&A series in which we're going to answer Starcraft 2 related questions, and we're going to grab questions off from Reddit. We're going to get it from the YouTube comments from these videos, from Team Liquid, maybe from the Battle.net forums, although I don't venture those as much, but basically anywhere where I come across these questions. So what the format will be is we'll do small episodes where we talk about questions that people ask on the forums that are sometimes basic, sometimes advanced, but we'll try and answer them like relatively quickly. So let's get right into it. Today's question is asked by Academic Joke and comes from Reddit, and he asks when to get Techlab upgrades for reacted starport and factory things. I'm talking about things like Drilling Claw, the medevac boost upgrade, and Liberator range. As someone new to Terran, they seem very awkward to get because they delay production quite a bit. My common sense tells me not to get them at all if I go for 2 base pressure, but when do I get them in a normal macro game? For example, if I want to go MMMMM, should I get Drilling Claws while doing single mine production, then switch to factory with a reacted barrack, possibly cancelling the marines it was making? Or do I just go for double factory and have a Techlab on one of them? I feel like the later is better for mines because they cost close to nothing, but I'm not sure about medevacs or liberators. Academic Joke asks a lot of things in one question, and it's a little bit jumbled if you just read all of it at once and try to answer it. So for this video, I decided we would just break his question into 3 parts, and we would answer each part one after the other. So the 3 parts are: should you actually get these upgrades? Like, are they good upgrades? Should we get them? The second one is, if we get them, what kind of strategies do we get these upgrades with? Because he does allude to 2 base timings compared to more bases and macro for like the longer game. And then also, how do we use our production facilities to get these upgrades? And what is the priority? Like, how important is it getting these upgrades? Let's start with the easy one first. Should you actually get them? Now this obviously depends on the strategy and it depends on the timing. So it's a little mixed with the second question he asks. And it obviously depends on the matchup. At first though, Drilling Claws, which is the upgrade for the Widow Mines, which makes them burrow faster and it makes them shoot 3 times faster, which is the period it takes for the Widow Mine to lock on to when it fires. This actually makes a pretty big difference. Specifically against Ling Baneling, because they run past the mine so fast. So when you have the upgrade, you get less of the times where you just see like Lings or Baneling run past mine and they don't trigger, and they'll actually be more likely to hit the Ling Baneling before they really get to surround your bio and cause friendly fire. So the Drilling Claws is a great upgrade if you can at all afford it against Zerg, if you are playing a strategy or a style or situation that warrants you having any like number of like medium to high number of mines, which is probably somewhere between like more than 6 to 8 in a game where you have high economy. Against Protoss, you never really get it because you never really have that many mines. Most of the time against Protoss, you only have a low amount of mines, somewhere between like 2 to 6, maybe 8 if you have a lot, but you don't have the same mass mine mentality where you keep reproducing them against Protoss. Against Terran, your factories are making tanks. You might have 1 or 2 mines from the early game, but you never get it against Terran. So Drilling Claws is pretty good against Zerg if you can get it in high economy situations. Terrible against Protoss, terrible against Terran. The medevac boost is pretty much universally not used and terrible. So to answer it very simply, don't get it. The Liberator range is harder. There are times for each matchup when it makes sense to get them, and I think the one that you will run into the most is against Protoss. And the reason why you often get it against Protoss is because a lot of the Protoss power units that come from the Robo, to some extent Immortals, but primarily Colossus and Disruptors, are really high range units that your Grand Army struggles to engage with and trade with. So you need the Liberators with more range to basically get shots off against these types of units that you wouldn't normally be able to. There is also the fact that you can do some harassment with them, although with the recent nerf to the Liberator that changed them from free shotting to two-shotting to free shotting, really put a dent in it. it can still be nice doing ranged Liberator Harass, but it's something that's kind of fallen out of the meta, and we would have to see some shifts in how the openers go in order for it to come back a little bit stronger. Against Terran, you sometimes will see Liberator range against mech because it helps to break siege lines. Specifically, what you're getting it against is if your opponent has a large number of tanks and they start adding in Thort with the anti-armored, anti-air mode, then they can actually pick off non-ranged Liberators reasonably okay. But once you start getting ranged Liberators, the Thors trade pretty poorly over time. So the general rule is if you are playing against mech and they start getting a really large amount of tanks and a really large amount of Thors, you will need Liberator range eventually to break it. Against Zerg, the Liberators tend to be mostly for the Ultralisks and to some extent Lurkers or Hydras and Ravagers, but not really that much because those units do okay against the Liberators anyways. So against Zerg, you almost never get Liberator range, simply because the way that the timing works in the matchup is by the time Ultras come out, you don't really have the time to get Liberator range, you just need Liberators right now. And the Zerg meta has shifted so much away from heavy Ultralisk play over into a couple of Ultras up into Spire, in which case, after you have a low to medium, somewhere between like 2 and 8 Liberators, most Zergs will tend to start going Brute Lords and Corruptors, and your Starports doesn't really want to make more Liberators, you start making Ravens or Vikings or Battle Cruisers. So it certainly does help because the area they cover is larger. The frontal range doesn't matter as much, it's more if you deploy them, they cover more areas against Ling Ultra, but you can actually get by without them pretty fast. If you are playing players you know will stick on like a lot of Ultras, you know, the traditional somewhere between like 8 and 15 Ultralisk, then getting Liberator range can be fine. But if you play against just a couple of Ultralisks up into Spire, it really is an upgrade you get very much. Now that we've looked at which upgrades should you actually get, the second part of the question becomes a little more interesting. Basically asking which strategies wants to get these upgrades. Well, as we talked about at first, most of these upgrades and what we need them against are things that happens at very high supply and later in the game. And because a lot of the early timings are very focused around getting out the maximum amount of units you can get early for a certain moment in the game, use them to attack, then because that is the goal, getting the upgrades and having less units really doesn't make up for having the upgrade. Because as we talked about, it generally is either against certain things or it's because you have a very high amount, neither of which is true when you do it early. So I think for the most part, you never get these upgrades early on. Let's say before free base, you never really get them. There are very rare scenarios where you get like drilling claws for like a cheese in Terran versus Protoss, or you get Liberator range in a cheese against Terran versus Protoss. But those are more very fringe specific things, which is not a general thing you should follow, unless you're doing like this specific cheese, right? That brings us to the last part of the question, which is probably one of the more interesting ones for newer players, and that is basically, how do I get them? How do I use my infrastructure to get these upgrades? Because we know that we don't need these upgrades early, we need them later against certain specific unit comps that generally tend to be relatively expensive, and we also need a decent amount of the units to actually make the upgrades work. By the time you need them, if you actually get into scenarios where you're like, wow, I really need these upgrades, then you probably have a higher economy game where you're not very scrappy. And then it makes sense for you to get a second production facility to get more of the units and obviously to research as well so you don't break your normal production cycles. So that means for the Liberator range, you get a starport with a Techlab. And for the drilling claws, you obviously get a factory with its own Techlab. I would strongly advise that you don't lift your production facilities off of reactors to make these upgrades. So basically, if you build mines two at a time, you don't research drilling claws upgrades from that factory, and the same goes for the starports. Generally, those two buildings are small bottlenecks in the Terran production anyways, because if you think about what does the typical mid-late to late game Terran infrastructure look like, somewhere between 5 and 8 barracks, usually closer to 8 than 5, 1 factory, 1 starboard. And if you start lifting those and making add-ons and then doing research upgrades and building one at a time, your compositions ends up being really skewed to something you probably don't want unless you had amazing unit retention on those units specifically. But for the most part, you would always use a second facility to get these upgrades as well, because you're also kind of saying, wow, I really need these units and I probably need a decent amount of them now. Then getting the upgrades makes sense. But if you only have a small amount, it doesn't really make that much sense. Alright guys, that does it for this question. I hope you enjoyed it. I actually had a lot of fun answering the question like this. I sometimes tend to answer them on Team Liquid on Reddit, but it's always a little harder to do in text form and you can't be as thorough. So I decided, hey, let's try video format. So if you enjoyed, if you have a question, leave a comment. And other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.